Welcome to our first episode of the Temperature Check webinar series. My name is Nili Gilbert, and I'm the Vice Chairwoman of Carbon Direct. The objectives of the Paris Climate Agreement are as ambitious as they are critical, and hitting our targets will require leaders from every sector to come together. This is why, as the host of this webinar series, I'm excited to explore diverse perspectives from leaders in finance, policy, from community leaders, corporate executives, and policymakers about what they're doing to accelerate climate action and what we need to do next. In that light, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome the Comptroller of New York City, Brad Lander, as my first guest today. Comptroller Lander focuses on many topics in his role, from city planning to community needs, to pension fund governance and investment strategy, including sustainable investment across all of its components. With his breadth of perspective, I'm excited to hear what he thinks can inspire action today. Comptroller Lander, it's great to have you here.
Thank you so much, Nili. It's great to be with you. I'm so honored to be your first guest, and I love the idea you have for this podcast, that it's to have the kind of conversation you have on the sidebar at a conference where you and I have had some great conversations. And, you know, the speeches on the panels are always good, but it's so often in those side conversations when you get a new insight, make a new relationship, you know, and really start to move forward on something. So really honored to be with you.
Thank you so much. We have had such great conversations, and it's exciting to share some of those ideas today with our audience. And you are such a leader. One of the things that we've talked about is that the path ahead on climate, we talk about the science, but in many ways, it's primarily a leadership journey. And for many of us, it's both a personal and a professional calling. So to kick off, I just wanted to ask you what first inspired you to use your leadership role to focus on sustainability and advocacy. Just a little bit about your personal journey and background in this field.
Thanks for asking. I think it's such an important place to start. And, you know, in many ways, my path to advocacy, to organizing for change, for building a better New York City, but in so many ways just better communities, didn't actually start grounded in climate. It really started grounded in community development, anti-poverty, and affordable housing work. I went to college on the south side of Chicago, and was just so angry at the inequality that was there, visibly on display, and felt like it was critical to do something about. And I got to meeting people in community development organizations, nonprofit neighborhood groups on the south side of Chicago, organizing for change. And I was really inspired by that. And that was what led me to want to be part of the community development movement, let's call it, grassroots neighborhood organizations working for change in their communities. And I decided to have a career in that. So when I moved to New York, I started working at a place called the Fifth Avenue Committee, which is a nonprofit affordable housing, tenants' rights, economic justice, and neighborhood development organization. That was in the early 90s, really in many ways just as the environmental justice movement was being born.
Yes.
And over the years, I started to see the connections between that community development, anti-poverty, affordable housing, tenants' rights, economic justice work, and all these climate and environmental issues. The neighborhood just to the south, Sunset Park, with a bunch of power plants and all of the impacts of environmental injustice. And then I had kids, and that starts you thinking a lot more about the future and the long term. And in many ways, it was through the activism of young people that this clarity that sustainability is an essential element, not just for the planet, but for every one of our neighborhoods, and that it's a place in which opportunity is created, but also injustice is created if we don't do something about it. It's perpetuated. And this, so I ran for city council, still mostly focused on affordable housing, economic justice, workers' rights, public education. But over the years, climate just rose up and up and up and up. And when I got elected city controller, which is a job in many ways to keep an eye on the long term, it seems to me clear that if your job is focused on the future, then sustainability, confronting the climate crisis has to be job number one.
I really appreciate how you started with community development and justice topics, and that brought you in a way to climate. Um, Today, there's an appreciation that we can't solve one without the other.
That's
As a matter of fact, we have an interconnected system, and these things don't exist in silos. And I also think a lot about what you said about kind of both injustice and opportunity. They're flip sides, I think, of the same coin. We're on this journey where we have so much that we need to reimagine and rebuild. And we can embed principles of justice in the way that we work on climate topics. We can embed governance. And really lift the system together in a way that's holistic.
Yeah, we'll come back to this when we get to investing, because I think it's easy to focus only on risk, and harm, and you got to do that, but you can get paralyzed. I worry in the investment space at the moment that some people are just only focused on opportunity. Like, you can make a lot of money investing in climate solutions and transition, but then you kind of ignore the need to draw down fossils. And so anyway, we'll come back to that when we get to investing, but you really have to hold both of those things together in the work.
We are going to come back to that. Speaking of holistic, I wanted to learn more from you just about what your daily role is. Actually, being controller covers so many facets, and you lead in all of them with so much energy. For those who might not be familiar, would you be willing to explain to us what the New York City Comptroller does, and
No one
how
is
you use the position to lead in these topics?
absolutely no one is familiar with the job of New York City Comptroller. So I like speak at a lot of graduations, CUNY and middle school and even elementary school, high school graduations, and I do a bit about like who's dreaming of growing up to be a comptroller, and I've never had a hand raised yet. So
Oh no.
every now and then a kid will come up afterwards and say, I want to be a comptroller, but I don't think they were thinking about it before I spoke there. So yeah, the New York City, and you can say it either way, comptroller or controller. And the job is the chief financial officer for the city and also the chief accountability officer. So on the financial officer side, we do the city's annual audit. We make sure that the way that we've said we're supposed to be spending the money is where it gets spent. We're the budget watchdog for the city. I don't get to decide where the money goes, but I keep an eye on every penny. We register contracts and make sure they're let appropriately. We do the underwriting for the city's bonds that finance our infrastructure. And then most important for this conversation, we manage the city's 5 pension funds. I'm the investment advisor, custodian, and a fiduciary on those funds, which have their own boards that I'm a member of, but then I also serve as investment advisor for each of them. And that's $270+ billion of assets under management that are the retirement security, teachers and firefighters and public hospital nurses and school crossing guards and all the amazing municipal workers that make the city run, to whom we promise retirement security and then have to invest the funds in a way that's consistent with those promises. And then I'm also chief accountability officer. So we're responsible to audit every city agency at least once every 4 years and make sure they're doing the job appropriately. And we find places we can do government better. Some of that is catching waste, fraud, and abuse, but a lot of that is saying, what are the goals of this program, of this spending, and are we achieving them? And are we achieving them efficiently? And are we achieving them equitably? Equity and sustainability are part of that. We have climate goals. We're thinking about how resources are distributed. And, that's a critical part of accountability. It's not only efficiency, it's also, are we meeting the promises that we've made? A kind of democratic accountability. And then I think there is this sort of chief long-term view officer role. Our politics are pretty short term. You know, people are thinking about the press cycle or the next tweet, maybe the next election, but pretty rarely, you know, 10, 15, 20, 30, 50 years down the road. But we're assigned to those pension obligations run out for decades. Our bonds are 30 years. And so part of the job is thinking about the city's future in that long-term way. And so that means investing the pensions wisely. That means thinking about public education and workforce development. And it most certainly means confronting climate risk, both doing our part as a city to reduce emissions and mitigate the climate crisis, and then, of course, adaptation and resiliency and getting our city ready for the era of rising seas and rising temperatures and smoky skies and all the impacts that we know are coming, that we've got to act now if we're going to be ready for.
Mm-hmm. Focusing on the long term is something that I think is very clarifying for leaders, and as you mentioned, across accountability, across investments, across city budgeting and planning. These are all long-term issues. Sometimes, especially in the markets, the focus can be so short-term, and I think it pulls us away from best interest, even for investment performance.
Absolutely. You know what, I usually start when someone says, what's the connection between your portfolio? You know, there's this challenge, especially that, you know, right wingers are making now between returns. You know, we actually saw this yesterday. The CalPERS CIO was in front of Congress, and, you know, MAGA Republicans just blast away with, isn't the job making the most money for your beneficiaries? And we are fiduciaries. We do have the obligation to maximize returns, but that's a long-term responsibility. My job is, I'm not a day trader. Those obligations that I have literally run out decades. If you've got a first-year teacher, started teaching this year, you know, I'll go to a 5th grade graduation, and those teachers, let's say one of them is brand new. So we hope they're going to teach for 30 years, you know, 25, 30 years, and then they're going to retire. And hopefully they'll live another 30, 40 years beyond that. So the pension obligations that they're incurring today run out to the end of the century already. And then in addition, when you're investing $270 billion, you're a universal investor. You're invested globally across the economy. And so you can't just, like, with that much money, you know, pick one little sector. You know, you can't decarbonize your portfolio. You have to, you own the carbon emissions of the global economy, essentially. And the harms that will be caused and the way that we will burn up those dollars if we don't achieve our decarbonization goals are literally sitting in our portfolio, you know, over the time horizon of our already existing obligations. So that both kind of universal or global and long-term view mean that ambitious, bold action on climate is just entirely consistent with our fiduciary obligations. And ignoring that and saying, you know, what I care about is how much money can I make between today and tomorrow, next year or next decade, be damned, is short-sighted financially as well as in other ways.
Yes, yeah. I really agree. I think even for those who aren't universal owners, the idea that you could somehow hedge climate risk out of your portfolio is misguided.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that you've spoken about climate mitigation, but also that you're thinking about resilience and adaptation to the physical risks that are already upon us today. That's a topic that I'm sure is really important to many New Yorkers. You know, I'm a lifetime resident of the city, and so I appreciate that you're leading in this space. Can you tell us a bit more about what you're seeing in terms of the risks that the city is facing and the resilience efforts and strategies that are underway to address them, how you think about it in your role?
Absolutely. Let me talk about 3, you know, coastal storms, extreme or flash floods, and heat waves, all of which we're going to be seeing in New York in the coming years, and none of which we're sufficiently ready for. So, you know, we got a coastal storm of enormous magnitude in Superstorm Sandy now just, you know, 11, 12 years ago. And, we saw what that did. That was just one form of coastal storm. It could get others. But that did, took the lives of a couple dozen of our neighbors, did over $1 billion in damage, knocked out our subways, knocked out our electricity, knocked out the terminals that receive gasoline, and therefore put traffic, the economy at a standstill for about a week. And on the 10th anniversary, 2 years ago, we did a report. So after that, there was a lot of planning for resiliency projects, making sure that there's new berms and the Rockaways and Red Hook and trying to protect neighborhoods. There's an idea, of course, for large seawalls out in the harbor that I think people have concluded are not what makes sense, but a wide range of coastal protections that can protect some neighborhoods. And then other neighborhoods that probably can't be protected. And we have to have a real conversation about transition and what to do where there needs to be retreat. 10 years later, we still have 10 years to go, basically. A lot of the project, we're going to complete the Superstorm Sandy projects at the current path, not until 2030, and in some cases even beyond that. So that speaks, we can't take 20 years to respond to a storm. But there are a lot of projects underway. I was actually out in the Rockaways last week, and some of that work is looking really good, and Rockaway beaches are looking good, but the neighborhoods are going to have more protection from the next storm. Then during Superstorm, when Hurricane Ida hit, and then last fall, Tropical Storm Ophelia, we've seen the dangers of flash flooding from extreme rainfall. And when Ida hit, that also was like a shock to the system. That hadn't happened in that way before. And it's easier to imagine coastal flooding because you know where the coast is. You don't exactly know where the pain points in your rainwater system is, because it's really like where your storm sewer pipes, kind of just can't meet need, and they're underground and you don't know. And so flash flooding takes place in some pretty unusual places. 11 New Yorkers died from Hurricane Ida. And that put us in a rush to get ready for extreme rainfall. And then just 2 years later, we got another of those storms. So the city has a bunch of plans. We actually did a report earlier this year. Is New York City ready for rain? And we found some places where progress is being made. But on the day of Tropical Storm Ophelia, basically half of the trucks that clean the catch basins were out of commission because they hadn't been well maintained. And so flooding was worsened by poor maintenance. So there's a lot we need to do there. The conversation about retreat is just not well advanced. It's hard to have, but not having it is unwise because we're leaving people in harm's way rather than having the courage to have our conversations. And then finally, the thing that takes the lives of the most Americans every year from climate is extreme heat. And that can be a more silent killer, although sometimes you get brutal heat waves. New York has not yet had what Northern Europe had last year, or what Chicago had in 1995, but unfortunately, or what India had just recently, but we will. And that is a different kind of preparation that's helping make sure people have air conditioning, that there are cooling centers available, that there are systems for checking on seniors and vulnerable folks to make sure that they can get to cooler spaces and get water and food, the things that people need. And I don't think we're ready for that one either, unfortunately. So yes, and all of this needs new social infrastructure as well as new physical infrastructure. I mentioned being, kind of from the community development movement. We're going to need a neighborhood infrastructure in which people know to go check on the seniors when the heat waves hit. And community organizations that have some responsibility for cleaning the bioswales to make sure that the catch basins are clear, and ready for rain. So there's a lot of transition work to do. It's hard to get people to do on the day after one of those storms. Everyone's mad that it wasn't in place.
Right.
But honestly, just a week or two or three later, and certainly a year later, people kind of forget and are focused on affordable housing and crime and other pressing issues. And so the urgency with which we need to build out both the social and physical infrastructure for the era of the climate crisis is hard to sustain. That goes back to how do you keep the long-term view? This isn't even the long-term view. Those storms are all hitting now. They're just sporadic, and therefore the work, you got to prepare for rain on a sunny day. And that's not as easy to keep people's attention on, but it is absolutely critical.
It is a matter of attention. New Yorkers have so many things in front of them, so many opportunities and concerns. I would think that when it comes to physical risk, that this is a topic that can kind of push through other divides. There may be folks who are not as worried about climate mitigation, but they worry about the physical risks in their neighborhood. But the point that you're making is that it's a matter of attention over time.
And I also think building in you can bring these things together. What I learned in the community development movement is there's a lot of cross advantages. So you're building affordable housing, but you're helping people get jobs, and then you're organizing the neighborhood street fair, and you can do the same with some of this climate work. The IRA is giving us all these opportunities to install rooftop solar. And the more we can have the same networks of community organizing and civic social infrastructure, helping, say, okay, what are the networks that we need to make sure folks who live in basements are notified when extreme rain is coming? But that same thing can be, what are we doing to train our young people to get the jobs that are available in installing solar, or in a place like New York City, offshore wind? So, you could take advantage of sort of both, and then you get leadership. First, you get, obviously the more you can tap into the economy and have people whose jobs are in doing this work. And then also a civic infrastructure of people who come to it for different reasons, but who work together to strengthen and build the capacities we'll need for both mitigation and adaptation.
That's really interesting, because that's what I wanted to ask you. Given your background in community organizing and the care that you have always had for your constituents as people and as families, how do we bridge these things? In a way, I think that your answer is coming back to what we were saying earlier, to present it as an integrated vision, an integrated package of solutions and vision for the future to the community that's exciting and engaging and helping to address their concerns. But it's not just saying, oh, we want to come talk about storms. We're coming to say we want to talk about all of these opportunities.
You got to meet people where they are. We actually
Yeah.
had in our office, we're doing a project with a network of high school students that kind of trains high school students in leadership development and advocacy. And the set of them that were decided to work on climate teamed up with us to think about making their schools resiliency hubs, places that could. And they were so honest. They were excited about it, but they said, Controller, I got to, several of them said, it's kind of hard in our schools. Like, people are going to tease us. Like, we think it's hard to get people engaged or excited about the climate crisis. You're in high school. And if we sound like scolds, like you better get ready, that's not going to work. And if we, and we don't want to just be totally viewed as like nerds, we don't mind, but that's not going to help us get more people to think about what we need to do in our school. And at first I just loved their honesty, and they were like embarrassed. They were basically like, in my school, unfortunately, people, the kids are like this. They don't care about that. And I was like, guys, that's just human nature. That's not your school. It's not something wrong with your classmates or young kids these days. Honestly, you're way more attuned to this than my generation was. People, this is kind of, again, we focused on what, but then you got to meet people where they are. And so if people in high school are thinking about what jobs am I going to do, right now, the jobs being created in businesses at doing climate transition are critical, and training people for jobs as solar installers and offshore wind techs and climate investors and climate scientists, and up and down the chain. There's just jobs for so many people. That's a great place to meet people. And look, people that get those jobs are going to be more attuned to these other issues, and you don't have to win them through you should care about this. You can win them through, here's a great opportunity that'll help you earn enough money to pay the rent in New York City. And if that has a lot of other kind of benefits for the city and for the climate as well, great.
I love hearing about this network of high school kids.
They're pretty great.
And the energy that they have, and that they're asking the same kinds of questions that we are. This is the question: how do we expand this climate community, this community of action? How do we speak with people? How do we engage with them? And I appreciate what you're saying, which is we meet them where they are. I think that this also dovetails to the leadership that you have across the 5 pension funds, the 5 city pensions, and the boards, where there too you face a range of perspectives
Yes, we
about
do.
sustainability topics. And this is something that you've been managing diplomatically. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about what's that like? What are you seeing across the 5 boards and their appetites and attitudes on sustainability issues?
It's a great question. So yeah, the New York City pension, there's 5 New York City pension funds. The largest is the Teachers Fund. The second largest is, so that's the Teachers Retirement System. Second largest is NYCER's, New York City Employees Retirement System. And that's the broadest. That's basically like all municipal workers who aren't teachers, cops, or firefighters. Then cops and firefighters each have their own funds, police pension fund and fire pension fund. And then there's a small one called the Board of Education Retirement System, which is non-pedagogical employees in the schools. So 3 of those funds are very ambitious on climate broadly. Teachers, NYCERS, and Board of Education, or BERS, have adopted some of the most ambitious net zero plans of any public pension funds in the country. They chose to divest from fossil fuel reserve owners in their public equity, in their public and private markets investments, have a net zero by 2040 goal, do shareholder engagement at companies, so we can come back to that, to push them to do better, have plans to insist that we get all of our financed emissions under science-based targets to meet their net zero goals. Just a very ambitious plan, and to scale up our investments in climate solutions, decarbonization technologies, which are now across the funds over $11 billion. The police pension fund and the fire pension fund have a less climate ambitious perspective. Now, the good news is they do believe in the climate transition investments. They recognize there's real opportunities in that transition, in solar and wind, in EVs, and they want to make money in those things. So across the 5 funds, we're investing it more and more in climate solutions. That $11 billion and growing is across the 5 funds. Our target is to get it to 50 billion. But the police fund and the fire fund don't have a net zero goal, did not divest from fossils, and don't do the same level of engagement to push decarbonization in our companies. And I really feel like this actually mirrors, and we keep pushing and advocating for them to do it, but they, their labor unions elect representatives that are half the board. And, it has to be consensus. And so we can propose things, but there's no point in, whatever, in order to win the votes, we got to persuade them as well. This is the money of their retirees. So I think that really mirrors what's going on in the investing space. I feel a lot of enthusiasm from many investors for scaling up investments in climate solutions. And you can see that is growing so extensively. But where we're really falling short is in the work to focus on what will be necessary to draw down fossils, because I think the path we're on will scale up renewables significantly, but just grow the global energy pie without actually, keeping the carbon in the ground and transitioning out of oil, gas, and coal anywhere near rapidly enough. If we had 100 years for the climate transition, I think this would work, because renewables will gradually cost less and over time they'll outcompete. But because you have so many sunk costs and investments in already existing oil, gas, and coal infrastructure, the owners of those are going to keep pumping them out unless we're disciplined, and without some form of carbon pricing, without mandated or legislated goals for drawdown. Investors have to act together to have decarbonization plans and insist on a reduction in emissions from fossil fuels, or it's not going to happen. And we can do that as investors. So we brought shareholder resolutions this year that persuaded, after years, JP Morgan Chase, Citibank, and Royal Bank of Canada to start disclosing the ratio between their clean energy investments and their fossil fuel investments, which are now 2-to-1 in favor of fossil fuels, have to be 4-to-1 in favor of renewables by the end of the decade if they're going to meet their climate goals. And unfortunately, they're not moving in that direction. Collectively, the 4 American biggest banks have lent over $1 trillion on fossil fuels, on new fossil fuel infrastructure since the Paris Accords. Another example is utilities. We own a lot of stock in utilities. 90% of the utilities we own shares in have set net zero goals, but only 11% have actual plans subject to science-based targets to achieve those goals. And so we're busy pushing them on that gap, but not enough investors are. And I feel that tension, as you say, even within our own funds. I'm proud we were able to take leadership on the 3 funds that are ambitious, but we have this work to do together. And I mean, I'll just give the final example here. Our biggest asset manager is BlackRock in private markets, and in public markets, excuse me. And a couple of years ago, Larry Fink's letter was all about ambitious climate transition. This year, his letter was basically like, we're switching to private infrastructure investments to scale up climate. Meanwhile, they're the biggest shareholder in all of the major fossil fuel companies, because BlackRock is basically the biggest shareholder in almost, in most things. And if they're not ambitious on pushing their publicly traded companies to get real on decarbonization, it's not going to happen. And so that really is a place where it has to be both and. I'm all for, the climate solutions investments, and that takes a lot of work. I was on a trip recently to Denmark. I saw amazing offshore wind technology investments. It's great. We want more of that. There's money to be made. There's jobs to be had, but we also have to do the work on drawdown, or we simply will not achieve our goals. For what it's worth, I just got an email with the air quality advisory for today in New York City. So the era of the climate
How are we doing?
crisis is this afternoon.
Well, it's interesting, and I appreciate that you bring this up. It's in climate, it's usually both and, it's all of the above. Sometimes I'll talk to leaders and they're very passionate about one kind of solution or one kind of an approach, and they talk about it to the detriment of others, where for the most part, what I see looking across science-based pathways to get to net zero is we're going to need a lot more of all of the things. And when I talk with leaders in finance across banks, asset managers, especially the large ones, and to a certain extent, especially the American and kind of North American one these days. What I hear a lot of them saying is that they feel it's going to be hard to get out ahead of policy. It's going to be hard for them to get out ahead of the climate pathways as they are, because they kind of are exposed to the economy, especially the economy and the policy of the country that they're in. And in the US, we see institutions receiving direct pushback from politicians, especially in red states. You were talking about the congressional hearings just this week. I wonder how you think about that set.
And let me add one more thing, because I hear both those things. And then one other thing I hear. So yes, I hear some people are pretty fatalistic with me, and they'll say, yeah, we don't think you're wrong. We think global energy use is growing, and absent policy change, we're going to blow past 1.5 and then past 2 degrees. Sometimes there's a magical thinking about carbon capture and sequestration, like we'll invest in climate solutions. We're not going to be courageous on drawdown of fossils, but then technology will take care of carbon capture and sequestration and just magically bring us back down. And there's a role for carbon capture and sequestration. So I'm all for people doing the research and coming up with technologies. Those, some of them are, might have big impacts that really need to be carefully thought through. But there's a role there, but magical thinking is not going to solve this problem. And I agree it would be better to have policy. So if that's that's point one, like, sure, we would be much better with global policy or ambitious national policy. I talked to some of the folks from Temasek, one of the big Singapore pension fund, and they have a price on carbon there. And so that makes their investing disciplined in a whole different way. And you can then actually invest in sequestration and carbon capture in a real way, not a magical way. So, a global or a US or a US and European price on carbon would be great, or genuinely mandated policies of transition and conversion, which we have some of, but just nowhere near enough, would also be great. That would be better than not having that and hoping that somehow market actors can do it. That said, we don't have that. And unfortunately, given our politics, it is not coming on the time frame necessary. I'm going to keep working to make it happen on the time frame necessary. There's a lot to do there, and everybody should. I mean, to some of those folks, I want to then say, okay, what are you doing to invest in policy that brings that about? Because if you're giving to MAGA Republicans through your PACs, you're perpetuating a policy, I mean, in these days, especially, anybody that is playing footsie with Donald Trump at this moment is responsible for burning the planet down, not just for polarized politics and hate-filled policies, but for burning the planet down. So, don't tell me I can't do anything as an investor, and also I'm going to live with a Trump presidency. But so, fine, get active in politics, and if you believe the future of the planet's at stake. But regardless, I think it's hard to see. The Inflation Reduction Act was as ambitious a policies we've ever had passed. It's great. It's helping so much, but it doesn't do drawdown. It just does investments in renewables. I think the odds of getting legislation that do seriously at even a US, much less a global scale, is very hard to see on the time frame we have. So if you know that and you're an investor with long-term obligations, you still have to act. And there are things we could do. I mean, the vast majority of market actors made Paris commitments. And if we all move together, if everyone says, okay, it is a prisoner's dilemma. Nobody by themselves can decarbonize the planet, and I can't control anybody else. But what was so great about the Paris Accords was everyone set goals that would help everyone. But it won't work unless we all move collectively. And if we let each other off the hook by saying, yeah, we said that, but we can't figure out the science-based targets, or we can't be responsible for pushing decarbonization, then we'll all suffer. All of our portfolios individually will suffer our collective failure. So I guess I would just say to folks who say that, we have to have more ambition if we believe what we're saying. And I think most investors still do. The red states are squawking and they scare people politically, but I honestly haven't met one, and that is leading folks like BlackRock and State Street and JP Morgan and many others to draw back, to leave Climate Action 100. I haven't talked to one finance leader who believes it. Like, those finance leaders see the same climate landscape as the scientists do. And there will be some political costs from the squawking, but if you share this analysis, that if we don't reduce fossil fuel emissions, we will burn up trillions of dollars in shared value, then you should act based on it. And some days that will be hard. But I think it is just utterly consistent with our fiduciary obligations, in addition to our love of our children and grandchildren.
Yeah, I really agree. And I think that observe that policy engagement is becoming also a standard tool in the engagement toolbox
Yes.
for finance. So it's engaging with policymakers to help them understand and advocate for policies that will help us to manage long-term outcomes in the pools of assets that we oversee. It's also engaging with the companies that we own on their activities related to policy, whether it's political donations or trade associations. And we have to do both things. I think a lot about the kind of dance between the sectors, the dance between public sector, private sector, and civil society, how we can push individually, but also where and how we can push together in tandem.
Let me give you a really interesting kind of example of this that we're engaged in right now. I mentioned the utilities. So we set a goal as part of our net zero plan to have 70% of our financed emissions in scopes 1 and 2 under science-based targets by 1 year from now. We set these goals a year ago, so we had a little more time. Now they're getting close. And across scopes 1, 90%, across scopes 1, 2, and 3 by 2030. But so for scope 1 emissions, a lot of our emissions, financed emissions, are with utilities because they produce them right there on site. So that was a place of immediate engagement. We sent letters to all of the utilities in our portfolio to say, we see you've mostly made Paris commitments, but have you set science, do you have a science-based plan? And again, I mentioned 90% of them have made Paris commitments, only 11% are under science-based targets. So we say, okay, let's get going. And they organize a big meeting with me because they know we're serious. This is an area where our divestment from fossil fuels helps. Our engagement is strengthened by our divestment. They know we're serious, which I think kind of there's often thought as like a fight between divestment and engagement. And to me, like these go together. You engage first, of course. But if you never would move your money, then like, why would anyone take your engagement?
People talk about engagement with teeth.
Yes.
If folks know that it can go somewhere, they'll be more eager to respond.
Really agree. So they get on this call with us and they're like, Controller, we all want to get under science-based targets, but SBTI, the kind of, main, science-based targets validator, doesn't really understand the utility sector. And so we're working with some folks to develop a separate, a separate framework for science-based targets for utilities. And our plan had said, we'll accept SBTI, but we're open to other validators. This is not a monopoly on validation. So they said, will you join as an advisor in this process of setting science-based targets for utilities? And we had a little trepidation because something that's started by the industry, there's a lot of reasons to be concerned about. But we said, look, we're not promising to sign off on it, but if you're asking us to look, review, give to, make sure we have our own experts, tell you where we think you're falling short and tell you whether we'll be able to accept this, fine. So we're doing that. And then some of those same companies are busy lobbying against regulations that would strengthen, the laws in regard to utility transition, saying, well, from a fiduciary point of view, we can't be regulated, and therefore, we don't, then similarly, we're not going to set targets that presume the regulations that we're busy fighting. And I'm like, no, that is not acceptable. Like so it just really goes to what you're saying. Like here, we need an ecosystem that it takes those Paris commitments seriously. In my opinion, supports, but at least doesn't oppose regulation that's consistent with them, and then build science-based targets for decarbonization that, yes, take into account stranded asset risk that will come from policy change rather than opposing the policy change to try to, quote unquote, reduce your stranded asset risk and allowing you to continue to burn fossil fuels. So yes, these, the policy, the engagement, and the investment decisions really have to go together.
There's also the school of thinking around the inevitable policy of response. Maybe it's just a matter of time, but eventually those assets will become stranded anyway as the climate realities come to us. And it would actually be better for companies to plan ahead,
Exactly.
manage that risk now, and trying to put in place the policies can't stop climate change, right? So the lack of policies can't stop climate change. So you also have been directly pushing back against some of the red state politicians who have been on the other side of this, who have been really pushing financial institutions and other corporations to back down on their sustainability commitments. This is a space that you can hold differently than the rest of us because of your role. What do you see in that? And are there any lessons or any hope? We've found ways, we've talked about ways of bridging with different viewpoints in other areas during this conversation. Do you see any transferable insights?
I mean, I'll say a couple of things here because my first statement is not going to be a very bridging one. I mean, what they're doing is just so transparently cynical. And I think it has to be called out. It is a faux populism to protect their fossil fuel donors and country club corporate buddies, like the idea that what red state, these are states that mostly didn't actually commit to their public employees very much and don't have good retirement security for their public sector workers, or they don't pay that much or give them very good retirement security. And then feign to care about returns, even as they're doing things like divesting from BlackRock from the right in ways that courts have found inconsistent with fiduciary duty because it's raising their costs. And yeah, then feigning a faux populism while just laughing with, letting their fossil fuel donors laugh all the way to the bank so that they can eke out, a few more years of profits. That's what this is. This is, a masked, right? It's donor service by red state treasurers and attorneys general. Unfortunately, they're pretty effective at it. And because they don't give a whit about actual fiduciary duty and will just go out and do this, they've played hardball, and a lot of asset managers are scared as a result, and it really is having impact. And of course, there's just the Fox News echo chamber. And we're not always that good at it. Yesterday's hearing in Congress, it did not come off well for people that care about climate. We have to be sharp. We have to show that, the work we're doing is really consistent with our obligations and a thriving economy and a thriving planet. And it is, and we can show it, but we have to get better at it. And I don't know, my strategy has been to be very bold and ambitious rather than cower, but I do feel like a lot of people just timid and hope to hide under a rock. And that is not the game that our opponents on climate are playing. And they may be able to slow action, enable their fossil fuel donors to burn a few more years of profits with huge long-term consequences for all of us. So, this is why, my strategy is to kind of keep speaking out and being bold. Now, there are some important places of bridging, and I do think job creation around renewables is one of them. As I mentioned, our police and fire funds are happy to invest in wind and solar. Look at the state of Texas, where you got the worst politicians from the right, and yet the most onshore wind being built of anywhere. And the faster the Texas economy is increasingly dependent on wind energy, the more people whose livelihoods and jobs in politics will reflect that. Bridging with the unions by creating climate jobs in offshore and onshore wind and solar and battery storage and EVs, and building a thriving economy and thus a thriving politics in blue and red states around renewables is at least one thing that will shift the politics. Whether that can happen rapidly enough for what we need, I don't know. But it's at least one pretty hopeful thing. So I do think there's a great organization called Climate Jobs. They've got an institute at Cornell, and they're kind of building these coalitions in states across the country, red and blue, focused on good job creation through climate transition. So that's one hopeful space that I think will eventually change red state politics on climate. Obviously, we need all hands and we need urgent action, but that's one promising space.
This comes back also to your message of meeting people where they are. And as we begin to wrap up, I also wanted to come back to where we started, talking about that intersection between all of our goals, right? The environmental and climate goals, our social goals, our goals for leadership and governance. You also have been a strong voice and leader on the topic of labor rights, which is a very important social issue. I just wanted to ask if you would be willing to share a little bit more about what you're seeing in that space and how you think that support for this topic pans out across communities with different views.
And this fits within this broader issue that we often talk about of just transition, which I don't think, I think there's some risk that just like buzzwords, and that we're not really clear and serious about it. And it means a bunch of things, which is challenging because there's the global questions of just transition and how to think about the global South, which hasn't been able to make the transition to a modern economy yet. And are we gonna, so they're saying fairly, don't deny us the energy that our people need. And you've got the Inflation Reduction Act to drive investment in renewables in the US, but what's driving that transition in the global South? So that's an important element of just transition that we're not going to get into here, but it's critical. You've got environmental justice communities here who have borne the harms of the fossil fuel economy and have it in high asthma rates. And then you also have this issue that you've got people whose jobs and livelihoods have been in fossil fuel infrastructure and energy. And, if you tell gas workers, union gas workers in wherever in New York, we're going to end gas in New York and switch to electricity and eliminate your jobs and not make sure that you can secure your livelihood and your family's future. And what's worse, the new jobs that will be created may or may not be union jobs, and they might be like crappy jobs in, where solar, I'm not saying this is happening right now, but solar installers will, hire non-union immigrant workers and pay them in cash with no health insurance. Then of course they're going to say, well, that doesn't sound good to me. I'm going to fight like hell to keep the gas infrastructure and our good union jobs. And so we have to make sure that the work in climate transition is good work. It pays a decent wage, has career opportunities, has health and safety, and people's right and opportunity to form and organize unions is protected. And that's why even businesses who might think, why would I, care about workers' freedom of association? I mean, first, it's your obligation under the law, and, but also, if we're going to succeed collectively in building support for policy for these transitions, people have to see them as good jobs. And we have to do the work with folks who are in fossil fuel energy jobs to say, okay, you're energy workers. There's going to be energy work. Let's think about how that transition takes place and you can benefit from it. And that's harder in a place like West Virginia, but we just talked about Texas, not so hard in Texas, not so hard in New York City. There is lots of work. And so making that work good work, and how it pays and its protections and its benefits and in its union organizing rights is critical. So yes, we're very active as investors in ensuring workers' freedom of association to form and organize a union, and making sure companies have good workforce management practices. Because again, this goes back to being a universal investor. The more the economy flourishes, the more our portfolio rises, the better we do all around.
Well, Thank you so much again for this conversation. As we close, I want to end exactly where we started, which was back to the personal. I mean, we are passionate about this work. It's also hard, right? We've talked about a lot of things that are going to be hard, or that we really need to dedicate ourselves to assiduously to get them done. So as we go out, I just wanted to ask you briefly, what keeps you feeling optimistic on this journey? When you get up in the morning, what would you say is motivating you most and fueling and driving you as a leader today?
Yeah, let me tell you about a young woman I just saw over the weekend at a memorial service, actually. This young woman's going to be a junior, yeah, I think no, a senior at Columbia. Her name's Rebecca Shubnam. I met her when she was in 6th grade. She got active at her, and grew up she's Bangladeshi New Yorker, grew up in a low-income family in public housing, and got active through an amazing organization called Cafeteria Culture. The memorial service was for the founder of it, Debbie Lee Cohen, this amazing teacher and climate educator, who got young people involved in trying to get styrofoam out of their schools. And then moved on to getting rid of plastic bags. And of course, the kids really intuitively get what's wrong with styrofoam and plastic bags. So they're great organizers. So 6th grade, Rebecca Shubnam came to the city council to testify against styrofoam. And Debbie Lee turned out had something else to do, and so was supposed to help her ride the bus there, but then she had to go to a medical appointment. She's like, "You got this, Rebecca." Rebecca was a little too scared to ride the bus, so she walked from the Lower East Side to City Hall, where she was the last person to testify. And then a few years later at the Youth Climate March in 2019, I think it was, I'm like hitting a beach ball with people on the lawn, and all of a sudden I hear this voice ring out, and there she is on stage with other global climate leaders. And she's become this like amazing young climate activist. And then I saw her at Debbie Lee's memorial service over the weekend, and she's now an activist at Columbia. And she's in touch with folks in Bangladesh where they're feeling, the heat and rising sea impacts. And I just, on the one hand, feel so, hopeful for leaders like her and her future, and thinking about, the world she's inheriting. And she's pretty honest about her anxieties about that future. But also like what she learned in cafeteria culture is the possibilities that activism can succeed. So yeah, I guess that's mostly where I go when I need a dose of hope. I go visit a CUNY campus or talk to some young people in high schools or meet my kids' friends, and they're anxious about a lot of things. I mean, the mental health crises and COVID and climate and affordability, but they're bright and brilliant and hopeful, and it's worth fighting for their future.
That's such a great answer. I've got to track down Rebecca. She sounds amazing.
She would be great for your future episode.
Exactly. I'll follow up with you.
Great.
I want to thank you again so much for being here. I've really enjoyed this conversation, as I always do, and thank you for bringing this kind of conversation to the broader community. As we said, this climate action journey is going to be a whole of society effort. So looking forward to continuing to work with you.
Thank you so much. Wonderful to talk to you. I look forward to watching.
A wonderful day.
You too. I look forward to watching future episodes.
Thank you.
Take good care.